April 1944. Somewhere off the eastern coast of the United States. Sound fades in, the deep drone of a ship's engines, waves slapping against steel hulls. Wind howls over the Atlantic. The Liberty ship SS John L. Sullivan creaks under the weight of its human cargo, nearly 2,000 German prisoners of war, silent beneath the American flag. Salt spray clings to their uniforms, still marked by dust from Tunisia, Sicily, Normandy. They were the soldiers of the Reich, trained to believe they fought for an unstoppable empire. Now they are headed to a land they had been told was decadent, divided, and weak. But as the ship cuts through the gray Atlantic, the fog begins to lift, literally and symbolically. On the horizon, a continent of motion appears. Steamships slide across rivers the width of the Rhine. Factory chimneys pierce the clouds. Railways thread the horizon in endless lines. For men who had marched across bombed-out Europe, the sheer order and vitality of America is something almost unreal. They had lost a war of weapons. Now they would witness a war of production, and it would change them forever. The irony of defeat. When the first contingents of German prisoners stepped onto American soil in early 1943, they expected punishment, humiliation, perhaps starvation. They had been taught that the United States was a land of chaos, run by capitalists and immigrants, without unity or discipline. But instead of barbed wire and vengeance, they found a machine of mercy and efficiency, built not from ideology but from industry. The contradiction was immediate and profound. These men, engineers, farmhands, officers of the Wehrmacht, had served a nation that worshipped steel and speed, precision and progress. Yet they arrived in a place where those same ideals had been realized at a scale they could not imagine. They had fought under the belief that German science was unmatched. Now they stood on train platforms where locomotives the size of apartment buildings thundered past, each hauling more goods in an hour than entire divisions could carry in a day. The shock was not just physical. It was civilizational. The first glimpse. From Boston to New Orleans, from the Great Plains to the desert camps of Texas, German POWs were dispersed across a nation that had mobilized for total war without sacrificing abundance. They passed through shipyards glowing with acetylene light, where women wielded welding torches beside men. They crossed miles of assembly plants, where rows of aircraft rolled off production lines like clockwork. Everywhere they saw movement, trucks, trains, cranes, conveyor belts, an endless choreography of logistics and labor. A German sergeant, writing secretly in his diary aboard a transport train bound for Oklahoma, recorded, "We thought we knew what power looked like. But this is something different. Every mile is filled with it. It feels like a giant that doesn't know its own strength." That sense of awe would repeat itself thousands of times over. Two civilizations in contrast. The war that had begun as a contest of armies had become, by 1944, a battle of systems. Germany, for all its technical brilliance, had built its war machine on control, forced labor, rigid hierarchy, and the myth of racial destiny. America had built hers on organization and freedom, on the chaotic but creative energy of millions working toward a single cause. To the prisoners, this contrast was almost impossible to process. How could a society that allowed dissent, diversity, and improvisation outproduce the meticulously planned Reich? How could a democracy, which they had been told was weak, generate the tanks, ships, and planes that now surrounded them? The answer was written in every horizon they crossed: the factory, the farm, the freight yard. Here was a civilization powered not by fear but by belief in work, in scale, in possibility. The landscape of power. When German POWs were marched through small towns en route to their camps, they saw children eating ice cream while their parents loaded trucks with war goods. They saw families who, despite rationing, lived with more comfort than many German officers. They saw fields worked by machines that seemed to multiply human effort 100-fold. In Texas alone, more than 70,000 German prisoners were held by the end of 1944. Their camps sat amid oil refineries and wheat fields, near air bases that buzzed with training flights. The prisoners were often assigned to help harvest crops or repair roads, daily contact with the backbone of American productivity. It was here, not in interrogation rooms or propaganda lectures, that their worldview began to shift. They watched civilians drive tractors that dwarfed German armor. They saw farmers operate radios, telephones, and electric pumps with ease. And they noticed something subtle but revolutionary, that Americans treated them, even as captives, with a degree of dignity. The guards were stern, yes, but fair. The food was plentiful. The rules were clear. And behind it all was a sense of order, not born from fear of the state but from faith in systems that worked. The shock of scale. By late 1944, more than 425,000 German POWs were interned in the United States. To transport, house, and feed them required a logistical miracle, one achieved without crippling the war effort. Camps were built with prefabricated materials. Supply chains ran on schedules measured in minutes. Factories that once made automobiles were now producing aircraft engines by the thousands, and the same efficiency that fed soldiers abroad also sustained their captives at home. When groups of POWs were taken on work assignments near industrial zones, in Kansas, Illinois, and Michigan, they saw assembly lines stretching into the distance, staffed by civilians whose productivity outpaced anything they had seen in Europe. One former Luftwaffe mechanic recalled, "We were taught that Americans were lazy and wasteful. But when I saw how they worked, the tempo, the machines, the cooperation, I realized we had misunderstood everything." That realization was the beginning of transformation, not of allegiance but of perspective. The human paradox. The German prisoners came expecting punishment and discovered prosperity. They came from a culture of discipline and encountered one of effortless organization. They had believed themselves the bearers of civilization, yet found themselves in the presence of a civilization that had out-industrialized their ideology. Here lay the profound irony of the war. The United States had never sought empire in the old European sense, yet its economic might reshaped the world more completely than conquest ever could. For the men behind barbed wire, that truth settled slowly, like the hum of a distant engine that never stopped. They were surrounded not by armies but by production, the silent, relentless force that had won the war before they even realized it. The thesis. This is the story of that revelation, of how the defeated came face to face with the true power of their enemy, and how that encounter would ripple far beyond the fences of the POW camps. It is not merely a tale of captivity but of discovery, the discovery that freedom, innovation, and faith in ordinary labor can forge a weapon stronger than any gun or ideology. In the quiet fields of Texas, in the clanging factories of the Midwest, in the endless rumble of American trains, they saw something their leaders had denied them. A civilization whose greatest strength was not domination but creation. They had come to America as prisoners of war. But many would leave as witnesses to its power, and, in some ways, its promise. The empire of smoke and iron built up. The journey began in silence. From the ports of Norfolk and New York, long troop trains wound their way inland, their cars marked not with the stars of the U.S. Army but with the black letters, PW, Prisoner of War. Inside, hundreds of captured German soldiers stared through barred windows at an America they had never imagined. Outside, endless movement. Cars, trucks, tractors, and factories, a continent alive with speed and order. In Europe, the Nazi propaganda machine had painted the United States as soft, a nation of jazz, consumerism, and chaos. Yet here was something the Germans had not seen in years: abundance. At every crossing, convoys of new jeeps rolled past. Refineries belched smoke in rhythmic pulses. The horizon was an unbroken grid of rails, silos, and cranes, not ruins but construction. To men coming from the rubble of Cassino and the scorched deserts of North Africa, this was civilization in motion. In the camps that awaited them, in Texas, Louisiana, Kansas, and the Carolinas, the organization was just as precise. Barracks stood in neat rows, their wood freshly cut. Every camp had a canteen, a medical hut, and even a library. It was captivity, yes, but it functioned like a factory of order. The Bureau of American Efficiency. By 1944, the United States had become the largest caretaker of Axis prisoners in the world. The War Department's prisoner of war branch operated like an industrial enterprise in itself. 425,000 Germans, 50,000 Italians, and 5,000 Japanese would pass through more than 500 main camps and 900 branch facilities across 46 states. Each camp ran on a system of precision and scale, the same system that produced tanks, planes, and ships. Work schedules were posted daily. Meals arrived by the ton, timed to trains and local supply depots. Even the fences and guard towers followed blueprints standardized by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. This was not accidental. It was the product of a mindset, the belief that organization itself could win wars. For the prisoners, this was the first cultural shock. Americans didn't just build machines, they built systems that made machines inevitable. Revelation by labor. Sound wind through fields, the low drone of a tractor engine. By the spring of 1944, thousands of German POWs were put to work, not in factories of war but in the arteries of American life. They picked cotton in Texas, harvested wheat in Kansas, cut timber in Oregon, and packed fruit in California. Under the Geneva Convention, they were paid modest wages, often a few cents an hour, and their labor helped fill the void left by millions of American men overseas. But what mattered more than the pay was what they saw. They worked alongside civilians, not slave overseers or party officials but farmers, machinists and women welders. They saw small towns with electricity, schools with buses, hospitals and places where Germany would have built bunkers. The efficiency of it all was bewildering. In one camp near Hearne, Texas, a captured engineer from Bremen watched a group of American farmhands repair a broken harvester. Within an hour, the machine was running again, using parts fabricated on the spot from scrap metal. He later wrote, "In Germany we would have needed permission, signatures, supply orders and days of delay. Here they simply do it. It is a culture of problem solvers, not rule followers." The turning point was not ideological, it was industrial revelation. Mechanized Eden. The prisoners had expected to see exploitation, but they found comfort born of production. Even rationing in America looked like luxury: white bread, canned fruit, cigarettes and soap. A former Luftwaffe pilot recalled his first meal in Camp McCain, Mississippi. "We were ashamed. The food was better than what our families had at home. The Americans served us meat twice a day. Even their guards apologized when the portions were small." Gradually, a strange form of respect began to emerge. The POWs started to realize that what they had been told was weakness, democracy, diversity, improvisation, was in fact the engine of America's strength. The U.S. was not a war machine built on obedience. It was a nation of motion where a factory worker could stop a line to suggest an improvement, and be heard. To men raised under authoritarian order, this freedom within structure was unimaginable. Confrontation, the clash of worlds. Sound distant thunder rolls, the metallic echo of a camp loudspeaker announcing orders. For every prisoner awed by America's productivity, there were others who resisted it. Die-hard Nazis within the camps, known as true believers, saw the respect shown to them by Americans as a kind of weakness. They organized underground cells, intimidated fellow prisoners, and enforced Nazi discipline even in captivity. But the system they fought against was one they could not fully comprehend. When German officers demanded to see an American camp commandant to protest working conditions, they expected arrogance or brutality. Instead, they met men who carried notebooks, schedules, and statistics, administrators who spoke in the language of efficiency, not ideology. One U.S. major, overseeing a camp in Arkansas, later recalled, "They came expecting a tyrant. I showed them our ledger, our ration plan, and the Geneva rules. I told them every man eats the same calories, guard or prisoner. They didn't know what to say." The confrontation between German rigidity and American adaptability played out quietly, but profoundly. In workshops, POWs saw American tools and methods that blended speed with accuracy, mass production meeting craftsmanship. They realized that while German engineers designed for perfection, Americans designed for repetition, to make 10,000 things that worked well enough, rather than one that worked flawlessly but came too late. Sound, soft turning of pages. The scratching of pen on paper. From behind the barbed wire, the prisoners wrote home. Their letters, censored but preserved, form one of the most revealing archives of the war. A corporal from the Africa Corps, interned in Nebraska, wrote, "They build everything here in quantities we cannot imagine. Entire towns seem designed for production. The people are not hungry. Even the smallest farms have machines." Another, from a camp in Arizona, described the sight of a train passing at night. "It took nearly half an hour to pass. Car after car filled with new trucks. No lights dimmed, no fuel saved. They have more than they can use." Through these small windows of language, a pattern emerged, admiration tinged with disbelief. In those words, we hear men confronting not just defeat, but a collapse of certainty. They had been told that Germany stood at the peak of civilization. Now, behind the fences of their captivity, they began to wonder if civilization had moved west. Consequences: the power of perception. Sound engines fade. Distant church bells. The hum of a radio broadcast announcing Allied advances. By mid-1945, the war in Europe was ending. The prisoners who had labored across America listened as their empire crumbled, Berlin in ruins, their leaders dead or captured. Yet for many, the true revelation had already occurred months earlier. They had seen what an open society could build when united by purpose. For the Americans, the POW system became a quiet triumph of logistics and humanity. The camps fed, clothed, and employed nearly 500,000 enemy soldiers without famine, riots, or moral collapse, an achievement unmatched in any other theater of war. It was not just a logistical victory. It was a moral demonstration of capacity. Transformation behind barbed wire. As re-education programs began, films, lectures and access to uncensored newspapers, the POWs transformation deepened. For the first time, they saw photographs of concentration camps liberated by Allied troops. The industrial horror of the Reich, factories of death, stood in stark contrast to the industrial abundance they had witnessed in America. Some refused to believe it. Others wept. One former U-boat officer in Camp Ruston, Louisiana, later wrote, "I had believed Germany represented order. But I saw here that order without conscience becomes terror. In America, order serves people, not the state." By the end of 1945, when the first groups were repatriated to Europe, the cultural imprint of their captivity was permanent. They had lived within a working model of what post-war society could be: productive without oppression, efficient without fear. Reflection, the hidden legacy. Sound, the slow rhythm of trains again. A new dawn rising over distant fields. When these men returned to a shattered Germany, they carried with them a strange and powerful memory of a civilization that had beaten them not only with arms, but with ideas made tangible through machines. Historians later called it the POW conversion, though it was less about ideology and more about experience. Those who had labored in American fields and factories became, unintentionally, the seeds of post-war reconstruction. In 1947, when the Marshall Plan began, many of these former prisoners, now free civilians, became interpreters, foremen, and engineers. They spoke fluent English, admired American efficiency, and sought to rebuild their homeland with the same practicality they had seen in their captors. The irony was complete. America's most powerful weapon turned out not to be the atomic bomb, but the idea of productivity as freedom. The numbers behind the miracle. By the war's end, the United States had produced 297,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 124,000 naval vessels, 6 million rifles, 2.4 million trucks, and had done so while feeding and housing 425,000 enemy soldiers within its own borders. It was a feat without precedent in military history. To the POWs who watched it unfold, the statistics were less impressive than the sensation, the steady pulse of industry, the feeling that nothing could truly stop this machine once it began to move. A corporal in Camp Concordia summed it up in one line that has survived in his diary. "Their power is not in the factory. It is in their faith that anything can be built." The moral shock. Sound, a factory whistle. The clang of tools fading into quiet. For many prisoners, the greatest humiliation was not defeat, it was respect. They had expected cruelty. Instead, they were treated as men. They had expected scarcity. Instead, they saw abundance. They had believed in racial hierarchy. Instead, they labored beside Mexican, Black, and Native American workers, all part of the same war effort. In a world poisoned by ideology, this quiet exposure to equality was revolutionary. By the time they boarded ships back to Europe, thousands of German POWs carried new convictions that would later shape West Germany's democratic rebirth: respect for labor, for fairness, and for the invisible machinery of a free society. The broader reflection. Sound, ocean waves again. A ship's horn echoes over the water. When the last ships departed American harbors in 1946, carrying home the defeated soldiers of a fallen empire, they sailed not into shame, but into enlightenment. They had been witnesses to the real arsenal of democracy, not the weapons, but the culture that made weapons unnecessary for dominance. This was the revelation that stunned them. That a free people working without fear could produce not just more, but better, faster, and together. And somewhere deep in that realization was a quiet respect for the enemy they had underestimated. For in the rhythmic hum of America's factories, they had heard something eternal, the sound of a civilization that believed in its own capacity to create. Sound fades, the hum of engines, the faint echo of a train, a voice repeating in memory. We thought we were the masters of industry. But here we saw the true face of power, not forged in steel but in faith. That was America's unspoken victory. It was not won on battlefields, but in the minds of those who came to destroy it, and left transformed by its strength. The war ended long ago. The fences came down. The guard towers fell silent. And the men who once gazed through barbed wire at a foreign world returned home, changed in ways neither they nor their captors could have imagined. They had come as enemies of freedom. They left as witnesses to its power. The return. When the ships bearing German prisoners left the ports of New York, Boston, and Galveston between 1945 and 1946, there were no bands, no flags, no glory. Only the creak of ropes, the groan of hulls, and the heavy silence of men who had seen two worlds, and knew which one would endure. They returned to a Europe that lay in ruins. Cities like Cologne and Hamburg were heaps of ash. The proud industry of the Reich was a skeleton: silent smokestacks, gutted machines, shattered rail yards. In the rubble they found the echo of the world they had once believed invincible. But in their memories lived something else: the thrum of America, the rhythm of machines that never stopped, the abundance that had seemed endless, the fairness that had felt almost impossible. Some spoke of it quietly, others never spoke of it at all. But the memory persisted, a vision of what human will could achieve when directed not by tyranny but by trust. Seeds of reconstruction. Sound, the turning of pages, the quiet hammering of construction. In the years that followed, many of these former POWs would become foremen, engineers, and teachers in the new West Germany. They built factories modeled on efficiency they had once only observed. They introduced management systems that emphasized cooperation rather than command. And perhaps, without realizing it, they became the bridge between two worlds, transferring the lessons of their captivity into the foundation of a democratic rebirth. In interviews decades later, some of them spoke of America not as a conqueror but as a teacher. "We learned that freedom and discipline are not opposites," said one former officer. "They are two halves of the same engine." In their words lies the quiet irony of the 20th century, that the United States remade its enemy not through retribution but through exposure. The power of example proved stronger than the power of punishment. A different kind of empire. Sound, slow majestic strings. A montage of American factories, highways, and open skies. The Germans had once imagined empire as domination, a conquest of borders, flags, and obedience. But what they saw in America was something larger and more elusive, a civilization that conquered through creation. Its empire was invisible: networks of steel, commerce, communication, and imagination. Its armies were its workers, its weapons were its machines. And its victory was not the destruction of enemies, but the conversion of the defeated. It was the industrial gospel of the 20th century, and those who had once fought against it would become, in time, its believers. The moral irony. Sound, a single piano note repeats softly, echoing like memory. There is a quiet irony in this history. The Reich had prided itself on order, hierarchy, and discipline. But its order led to ruin, its hierarchy to cruelty, its discipline to destruction. America, by contrast, appeared chaotic, divided, even naive. And yet, from that chaos came a coherence more powerful than any doctrine. Its strength was not commanded, it was volunteered. For the German prisoners, this was the hardest truth to grasp: that a society built on trust could outfight and outbuild one built on fear. In the camp workshops, they had seen Americans share tools without question. In the towns beyond the fences, they saw women managing farms, workers debating politics, children laughing in abundance. They realized that freedom was not the absence of discipline, it was the discipline of belief. And perhaps that was the moment the war truly ended, not when Germany surrendered but when its soldiers understood the moral arithmetic of defeat. Echoes in the modern world. Sound, the low hum of modern machinery, an echo of the wartime factories. Today the fields where those camps once stood are silent, reclaimed by grass, highways, or the quiet hum of suburbia. But the story of those years remains etched in both nations' memories. The United States proved that power does not need spectacle to be overwhelming. It can move quietly through rails and rivets, through wheat and steel, through fairness and function. And the men who once stared out at those horizons carried that revelation into the next age, into a Europe rebuilt not for conquest but for cooperation. In time, many of them would welcome American aid under the Marshall Plan. Some would guide new industries, others would write books or teach apprentices. Their memories of captivity became parables, of dignity, of decency, of the idea that true might is not the power to destroy but to build and share. Sound, wind rises, faint echo of machinery fading into silence. In one surviving letter, written by a prisoner leaving Camp Concordia in 1946, a single line stands out: "We came to America in chains and left in thought." He had meant it literally. Their chains had been physical, their awakening intellectual. He wrote that he had seen a people who do not worship power, yet possess it completely. That sentence captures the paradox of the 20th century, the idea that freedom, unshackled and imperfect, can become the most efficient force in history. Because when men are allowed to think, to argue, to build without fear, they become unstoppable. That was America's secret weapon, not its machines but its mindset. The universal reflection. Sound, soft orchestral swell. Light glimmers on a horizon. The story of the German POWs is not just about war. It is about perception, about the shock of discovering that power and humanity can coexist. It reminds us that every civilization is judged not by how it treats its allies, but how it treats its enemies. America, in that brief moment, revealed a kind of moral industrialism. A belief that justice could be organized, that compassion could be scaled, that even war could be waged with decency. And in the quiet hearts of those who came to destroy it, that decency left a mark stronger than any victory parade. In the end, they learned something their generals never understood. That freedom, messy, flawed, ungovernable freedom, is the greatest engine ever built. Sound fades to silence. The final image lingers, a train track disappearing into sunrise. They came as prisoners of a war for domination. They left as witnesses to a world built on creation. And in that revelation lies the true story of power. That the mightiest nations are not those that conquer the earth, but those that build it anew.